One of the nice benefits that can come from personal growth is that you can enjoy your life more. We're all only alive for a certain period of time. We've got this gift of, roughly 80 years on Earth. And I think trying to make the most of that time is important. And another really influential book for me was 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. He has this paragraph which talks about your life experience is essentially the sum of your moment-to-moment experiences, right? So if you can take greater pleasure from the day-to-day experiences, then you're going to have a happier, healthier life.
Welcome to the After Peter Pan podcast. I'm your host, Pat Teneriello, and today I sit down with my friend Alex Brzostowski, who I like to call the walking encyclopedia of self-improvement. Alex has read a ton of transformative books that have reshaped his physical and mental health. After experiencing sudden loss in his family, Alex re-examined his career and life priorities. This led him to broaden and redefine his definition of success and create his 4 pillars framework, which emphasizes family, self-care, friendships and community, and financial stability. In this conversation, we dive into his story, exploring practical advice, habits, and key insights from Alex and his favorite books. Things that have helped him build consistency and balance. Talking with Alex inspires me to aim higher and gives me a fresh perspective. I'm particularly excited about this episode because it's packed with actionable tips to help you make meaningful changes in your own life. Thank you for tuning in. Enjoy the conversation. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I grew up in Canberra, Australia, which is where I'd gone to both, school and university. And I think like many young people, there's just an urge to go, travel and see the world. A friend told me that she was applying for an exchange abroad, and I didn't even know about the university's exchange program at that point. So I went straight over to the exchange office, picked up a bunch of brochures, and then literally spent the rest of the next lecture just reading those. That was a week before the applications were due. So I was fortunately able to get my application in, and I ended up being accepted to my first pick, which was to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And that was a fantastic year and a very fortuitous year for me because I actually met my wife there.
You met your wife at Queen's?
I did. So we were in a housing co-op, and everybody in the co-op had to do 3 hours of work for the co-op each week. We were Tuesday lunch cooks, and that was how we got to know each other, actually. Eventually kind of, summed up the courage to ask her out, and, we'd now been together, 22 years.
Congratulations. That's amazing. At what point did you realize you wanted to spend the rest of your life with her?
That's a good question. Once we started dating, we clicked really, really well. Even though I'd said to her, I'm going home in 6 months type of thing before we started, we both really wanted to be able to pursue it longer term. So that was great. And obviously we had to kind of overcome this hurdle of, well, where is that going to be given that our 2 homes are on opposite ends of the world. She had already been accepted to medical school in Canada for after that. So it kind of made the decision that, well, she needs to be in Canada. And so if anyone's going to move, it was going to be me. And fortunately, she was able to sponsor me for permanent residency in Canada. Canada has a visa category that allows people in a long-term relationship who aren't necessarily married to be able to sponsor each other to come for permanent residency. So we were long distance for about 18 months. So after the exchange, I still had 3 semesters left back in Canberra. And it was sort of during that period that we got that visa application in. And I was thrilled because it was approved on the first go, which was great. And then packed up my life in Australia after graduating and moved to Montreal in January 2005. And that was when I started learning French.
So you guys did long distance for the remaining semesters till you graduated. And then you made the bigger sacrifice. And I can relate because my wife and I, being also from different continents, not quite as far as you guys, that's how it is. And honestly, we haven't fully decided who's going to be making the bigger sacrifice. How old were you when you made that decision?
20. We were 21 when we started dating, and I made the decision within a few months of that.
Have you always been someone who is ready to make serious, long commitments like that?
When we were talking about should I be moving to Canada and so forth, like it did bring up the question for us, do we see ourselves being together longer term? Right. And so I recognize that kind of like compressed the timeline of the relationship to a certain extent, because it really brought forward that question of, do we see ourselves being married one day? It's not that we got engaged at that point in time, but we obviously had that conversation around, well, is this something that we see working out? Because if that's not part of it, there wasn't a point in me going through that whole process to move there and so forth. Fortunately, we were both, really committed to the relationship. We saw each other about every 4 months between our semesters. We could see each other for a month or two, which was good. Yeah, but we were both pretty busy with our respective studies. And so because we were both sort of so preoccupied with that, so we talked a couple of times each week. But we also felt as though there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I would strongly advise people not to get into a long distance relationship if there is no longer term game plan for how you're going to end up being together.
How did you know she was the one?
We just clicked so well. And, when you fall head over heels in love with someone, it just is what it is, right? You just kind of know that. But something that I really appreciated with her was whenever we would have disagreements, we could openly talk about it. We could sort it out. I've been in relationships previously at sort of two different extremes. One extreme, my girlfriend at the time would just shut down and not want to talk about an issue. And I found that very frustrating, right? And then at the other end of the extreme, another girlfriend would just want to fight all the time. And it just felt like our status quo of the relationship was fighting. I actually remember one night after dropping her back at her house, thinking to myself, man, tonight was a good night. And I asked myself, well, why was it a good night? Because we didn't have a fight. And it was at that point that I realized that relationship was in trouble. Right. So I really appreciated with my wife that we were able to talk through, resolve issues. We were we're good about listening to each other. Back to the question about how did I feel comfortable with it and so forth. Yeah, I mean, it felt very natural to me.
Let's fast forward. So then you're in Canada.
Yep. So I'm happy to walk through that a little bit. So we, so initially learned French in Montreal for a while, which was a challenging experience at the time, but it gave me a better appreciation for the challenges that immigrants to a place where their language is the non-dominant language can face. And it was in Montreal that I started working for a software company. So that's how I fell into the IT sector. And after 5 years there, I did the MBA, which is where we met. And then after that, I joined an IT consulting company that was in Montreal. And my wife in 2015 had a great fellowship training opportunity here in Boston. And so that's what brought us to Boston. But fortunately, the planets kind of aligned nicely for us in that there was a position with the consulting company I was with at the time. They had an opening down here that I was interested in. Yeah, so that worked out well for the two of us. When we first came to Boston, it was with an open mind. We made a minimum commitment of 2 years down here, but I think the New England area is a great part of the US, and we've thought a lot to where we want to be actually since we've been here, and we decided to stay permanently here.
What were the key experiences or moments that sparked your journey of personal growth? Was it a journey you feel like you've always been on, or were there key moments?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll share first of all that in high school, actually even before that, I was actually a pretty terrible student for most of it, right?
I'm shocked to hear that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I did a complete 180, right? And then it was sort of towards the end of grade 10 where we started taking career classes and so forth. And I decided I want to be pursuing sort of more of like a white collar professional career, which meant going to university. So I had to start working and so forth. And it was also around that time that I'd received a book from my grandmother. And I honestly wish I could remember the name of the book so I could still find a copy of it. But it was sort of the idea of the book was, anyone can, achieve what they want to achieve if they put their mind to it. And part of it is around creating your own luck by way of deciding what it is you want to go after and setting yourself up for success by way of getting yourself ready to take advantage of opportunities when they come along. Right. So that might be trying to build knowledge or contacts, that kind of thing. And then jumping forward a few years, the first software company that I worked for in Montreal, I had a boss there, and he was a fan of Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So I really enjoyed that book. I thought it had a lot of really great ideas in it. And so that kind of sort of got me on the journey of those type of books as a source of good ideas, right? And just sort of like my personality is one that's kind of drawn to, picking a goal, pursuing it, always trying to do better. Yeah, so I'd probably put it down to like those 2 books that one I received from my grandma, one that I had learned about from a former boss of mine.
We can link down in the episode to some of these books that have had a really big impact on you. One question that came to mind as you spoke, there's 2 types of people, right? Those people who are like, I'm a certain way, I don't need to change. It's like, I'm just going to embrace who I am. And then there's like the other ones who are constantly looking for change and to refine who they are. And they embrace that ability to evolve and become someone different. Mm-hmm. How do you balance authenticity with growth, especially as you evolve?
I'm not sure you need to balance the 2. Right. Because to me, the idea of like authenticity is being, true to yourself and being your true self with others. Right. And I think that's definitely compatible with personal growth.
I was catching up with a mutual friend of ours actually yesterday, and she knew like the old Pat, right? And there's always this fear when I talk to people that kind of know that version better than this version. And this fear is like, I'm someone who's become boring. I was known for, in my mind, these fun things, right? Joking around and being teased for, being a womanizer or like a party guy or whatever. And letting those pieces of me die is like, I'm boring, or like I'm afraid as I talk and catch up with people, like, who is this shell of a human? It's obviously something that's in my own head. In the same conversation, I heard things like, wow, it's really impressive what you're doing and so on. But can you relate to that feeling at all?
For sure. And, that adjective boring, I've felt that myself at different times, right? But then I also come to realize that part of growing up is changing what's important to you or changing your behavior as a result of changes in, your environment and so forth, right? And or it can even be changes in yourself, right? As you get older, I've certainly found I'm not able to stay out as late, or I definitely can't drink as much as I used to. And so so there's nothing wrong with that. And I totally agree with you also on the point that it's in your head. I think there are so many times when we, tell ourselves stories or put labels on ourselves about how like other people might be perceiving us that are often in a negative manner. Honestly, like I'm very happy with the air quotes boring life that I've created for myself. I'm very happy in it.
And with that in mind, let's dive into some specifics, some practical routines that you do every day. The way that I'm thinking about this is sleep is super important. Physical and mental health are super important, and work-life balance. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about how you're incorporating practical elements into each of those.
So I absolutely agree with you that, the sleep, the physical, the mental wellness, and the family relationships and, work balance and work satisfaction, they're all like really tied together, right? And before I sort of describe some of like the individual components there, I'll share with you and your listeners that in the, the stay-at-home period of the COVID pandemic in 2020 was when I realized like, hey, I've actually got an anxiety problem. Right. And the way that it was manifesting in myself was that I wouldn't have trouble falling asleep, but then I'd be waking up, 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning, and I just couldn't get back to sleep. Right. Like it would take me hours to get back to sleep. And then I found often during the days, I'd be, worried about things because, hey, there's this new virus around. Right. At the time, my kids were in kindergarten and 3rd grade. Right. So they were now at home and were all of a sudden expected to be performing 3 roles, being a parent, being a worker, and also being a teacher, right? By making sure the kids are getting on for their classes and stuff like that. And there was also the US election going on at that point in time between Trump and Biden. And so there was just a lot of like stress going on. And there was one night that I realized like, hey, in the evenings, I'm just not relaxed. And then it kind of clicked for me that, hang on, this is anxiety, right? And so I mentioned it to my wife, and she was like, yes, that sounds right.
Do you think it was latent and COVID brought it to light, or do you think that COVID induced your anxiety?
I think everyone experiences some level of anxiety and stress, right? I think it's once it gets over a certain threshold that it starts to become problematic for people, right? And I think actually, although there was a lot of like negatives to the pandemic, and unfortunately a lot of people died and a lot of people became very sick and a lot of people had a terrible experience in 2020 when everyone was in that stay-at-home period. I felt very fortunate that I was with people that I loved, right? But I felt so sorry for people that were in domestic situations that it were either unsafe or unhealthy, or they just didn't have enough space, right? So for me, I think it kind of brought it over a threshold that it became more of a problem. There had certainly been periods earlier in my life when I might have had a bad night's sleep because I'd been, stressed about, either a project at work or something like that. But it hadn't been, night over night, that type of thing.
The signal you shared was around sleep. Were there other signals that may arise that listeners could learn about?
Yeah, so for me, anxiety often manifests as a feeling in one's chest, just sort of like as a ball of like energy or agitation, right? Maybe you could sort of think about it as restless legs, although it doesn't manifest like that for me. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not fully aware of like the full breadth of how anxiety can manifest in different people. But for me, it was just being like really worked up, often being very reactionary to things. So for me, I guess, the gift that came out of it for me was that it helped me recognize that I needed to chat with someone. So I actually engaged with a life coach to talk through some of those things, and that was immensely helpful. I still actually meet with that coach on a monthly basis, although the nature of our conversations has changed, and it's a lot more about, self-actualization and being the best person I can try to be and so forth. And she put me onto a number of books and a number of different programs. One book and program that I am a really big fan of and that helped me a lot was called Positive Intelligence by Shizad Shamin. I'm happy to spend a minute just sort of describing that framework. But one of his main ideas is that inside all of us we have a number of what he calls saboteurs, right? And so these are sort of like thought patterns in your mind that end up generating like negative thoughts or negative emotions to situations, right? And so his thesis is that one saboteur that everybody has is the judge, right? That's either a judge of yourself, judge of other people, or judge of circumstances. And you mentioned the judge component before, when you might think people think you're boring, right? Everybody has like negative stories they tell about themselves, but there's also like other ones, right? There's one called the restless, where you're kind of jumping between different things. There's a pleaser one where you try to like always like please other people to your own detriment. There's the stickler, which is where like everything has to try to be perfect. So he's got a framework with about a dozen saboteurs, and so it really helped me recognize those negative thought patterns in myself. And so then when I started to have them, he recommends to shine a light on it and be like, no, that is just the judge or the restless or whatever the other saboteur is that's causing me to think that. Right? And so I found that helpful actually quite immediately during that period. But he's also a big proponent on sort of like recentering your thoughts to try and sort of take you away from the negative thought pattern and to bring you sort of more back like into the moment. Like kind of like what one would do during meditation, where like you're focused on your breath or some other anchor, right? To try and bring you into the here and now. And so, he recommends doing, a number of what he calls PQ reps, which stands for like, positive intelligence, the notion of like, say like IQ and EQ, right? He calls it PQ. And his other third component to his framework, which I found really helpful, was called the SAGE perspective. And the sage perspective is that in any set of circumstances or a situation, you can always find a gift and opportunity. And so, just as an example of that, like if whenever you might be going through, like, say, a tough challenge, like say if you're having a disagreement with your spouse, right? The gift or opportunity that can come from that is that you could actually, end up improving the relationship by genuinely, like, listening to the other person, understanding their perspective, and finding, a good path forward that ends up like with a better status quo than you had before. The gift from something might not always be immediately clear to you, right? But they're always in there. And I found that kind of helpful from the perspective of, even if something, really bad had happened or whatever, at least I could find a positive in it. And that kind of like helped from having a more positive mindset.
You're making me want to read this book. You talked about how you recognized anxiety, you did something about it, you chose the life coach route, you jived with the life coach, and the life coach recommended some resources such as this book that you're describing.
Yes.
Maybe just to close the loop on the life coach, because I've never worked with a life coach. I think probably most people have not. Like, how would you characterize it?
A life coach tends to be more like now and forward looking, right? Like helping you reframe events now, helping you identify, like what are the thought patterns that you're having, and helping you, like, just like interrupt thought patterns that aren't necessarily healthy or productive for you or that you want to be having, right? And I think there are different types of coaches, some that might focus on, personal relationships or business or health and so forth. But there's often a component as well of looking out at the future and sort of like trying to think about, where do I want to be in 5 years, and sort of, then sort of like working back from that. So it's a bit more around Maslow's idea of like self-actualization, like sort of like looking at how you can be better, what are the things you can be doing.
Let's continue into the specifics of your routines.
So, the 4 you had mentioned was around, sleep, physical, mental, and, family and work, right? So from the sleep perspective, I think sleep is so foundational to one's well-being, right? You need both high quality sleep and you need enough sleep, right? So, personally, I found I really needed to adopt good sleeping habits, or healthy sleeping habits. And so I get off electronics an hour or two before going to bed. We deliberately don't read the news anymore before going to bed. I found that was a real problem for me actually back in the pandemic. In the hour before going to bed, I'll try to do some calming activities, whether that be like reading or meditating, that kind of thing. And I try to be consistent in the sleep cycle just so my body can get into a good rhythm of it as well. So I typically go to bed around 9 o'clock and get up at around 5. And sort of like the 5 o'clock getting up feeds into the physical aspect of things, right? So like personally, I really enjoy both, working out at the gym for strength training as well as running for cardiovascular fitness. So I'll get those in the morning. I kind of discovered by accident quite a few years ago that I really love running early in the morning when there's like not many people around. I kind of sort of describe it as, the world's calm, the world's at peace. I kind of discovered it in Montreal, and it was a real privilege getting to run up on, Mount Royal. And so like at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning in the summertime, it was fantastic. It's just a time when I have sort of like some of my best thinking. But the reason why I still do it now so early also is so I can get home by around 7:15 and still be here for when my wife and kids are having their breakfast, and I can help get the kids ready and out the door for school and so forth. But another important aspect from the physical side of things is to eat healthily, right? As I've aged myself, become more aware of things like cholesterol levels and stuff like that. So I'm cutting back on junk food and saturated fats as well as drinking.
Do you follow a specific diet?
I kind of describe it as like eating cleanly would be the best description of it. There was a period where our family, well, at least my wife and I were vegetarian, and our kids, it didn't quite fit as easily with our kids when they were younger, right? So we kind of call it flexitarian now. whereby like we'll have chicken, but there's many days when like I don't have meat. And it's funny, I never thought I would actually get to that because I remember the period shortly after moving to Montreal, I had a saying that it's not a meal without meat. I just didn't feel satiated, but then I realized it was all in my own mind. Once you build a habit and you get accustomed to it, it worked out fine.
I was like you. A meal was not complete without meat. And meeting my wife and being kind of drawn into the Mediterranean diet, it's great. You know, in terms of protein, a lot of times it's fish. We tend to have protein at one meal a day. Breakfast will be like some yogurt and stuff. Lunch is usually just like what they call a primo. So it'll be some sort of pasta dish. And then the secondo, which is the protein dish, the meat dish, we have it for dinner. And that kind of works is you end up eating varied and it's never too heavy and it limits the amount of meat. So I find the Mediterranean diet is quite a healthy one. Do you eat a lot of fish?
So my wife actually hates fish. She just has
that makes it hard.
A violent reaction to the smell of fish. But fortunately, I like fish and my kids like fish, so I'll typically cook fish for myself on a Friday night. Like I'll typically like grill some salmon or something like that. But I think the Mediterranean diet's great. A book that had actually like influenced my thinking on eating well, as well as some other actually healthy habits, was Outlive by Peter Attia. And it was like that book that really helped me become more aware of blood sugar levels and avoiding large spikes and reactions to that. So, the past couple of months, I've been pretty deliberate about cutting out added sugars from what I'm eating, and sugar can be hiding in a lot of places, right? Like, the cereal that I was typically having for breakfast at that point in time, I didn't realize had so much sugar in it. And likewise with the yogurts and so forth. And orange, not only just orange juice, but typically fruit juices have, a high proportion of sugar in them.
Do you weigh your meals?
No. Okay. I try to be aware of, what's in my meals. About 10 years ago, when my daughter was born, I'd taken a couple of months off work. And at that period, I was like, you know what, I'm going to try and use this opportunity to lose a couple of pounds. So I got an app on my phone. It's basically a calorie counter app. And that was really helpful from an education perspective of just starting to be aware of, oh, wow, there's that much in that type of item, and so that was really healthy. That was really good. And that app has evolved over time to also then give better information on what's high in sodium or, high in protein or high in saturated fats and that kind of thing. So that's been a good education component, but I've been pretty deliberate about not wanting to focus on it too much, right? Because I think it can easily slip into an unhealthy habit as well.
Do you do cheat days? Programmed cheat days?
No, I don't do that. Do you?
I mean, not programmed, but there's definitely cheat days. Typically, a cheat day is encouraged because you're going to sway. You might as well give yourself permission to. So, how do you let yourself deviate from the plan? So, unfortunately for me, it's not typically planned. Right. Sometimes it might be that my willpower has been sufficiently depleted. Right. That I end up cheating around that. And so I'll share with you, within the past few months, I read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's a psychologist. And one of the things that he and a colleague of his had found was that people have only a certain amount of willpower. It's basically like a reservoir of willpower, right? And if you keep on using it up by being in the presence of temptations, eventually you're going to kind of end up giving up on it, right? And you'll end up cheating and so forth, right? So I think part of it is around trying to remove those temptations, right? I found that pretty helpful. And I've also noticed a correlation, say at the end of the week, whatever, if I end up having a cocktail or a drink, alcohol really actually reduces your mental ability to be able to resist temptation as well, right? So then I found that if it ends up being a day that I have a drink, that ends up being a cheat day because then I'll end up having junk food that I may not usually have. So I can totally relate to those 2 points you just made. They are spot on. One is I'm a good decision maker so long as I'm sober.
Yes.
Which is like, it sounds obvious, but when you're living a social life, you're going out for drinks, like you're a single person, you're a young professional, you're going out a lot. And so you're not like, you're sober during the day but you're working and you're making good decisions, but they're work related. And so you come home and you take a load off and all of a sudden you're not sober anymore. And then you're like, shoot, I'm not sticking to, all these great plans that I had. So I could totally relate to that one.
Yeah.
And the other one is like, think about Halloween. If you don't eat candy throughout the year, all of a sudden you got like a kilo of Halloween candy sitting on your coffee table. Of course, you're going to reach and grab a handful of candy. Like if you take the candy out of the house, like, yeah, it's going to be easier not to eat candy.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And you touched on a couple of things that the thoughts that I have. So I think like I'll just share a little bit further on like alcohol there. I also came to learn that it is like a satiation suppressant, right? So when you say you have alcohol in your system, your body has a reduced ability to recognize that it might actually be full from what it's already eaten or is eating, right? So you end up might be overeating.
What's your relationship with alcohol, by the way?
Fortunately, it's fine. During the pandemic, I did become a bourbon enthusiast, right? Fortunately, I never had a negative relationship with alcohol, but a couple of years ago, my mother had passed away from a colon cancer, right? And when I had a look at what are the risk factors for colon cancer, there's some things you can control, right? Not eating red meat, not smoking, exercising regularly, that kind of thing. But there's some things you couldn't control, like your age or your genes, right? But one of the factors that was still sort of like outstanding there for me was consumption of alcohol, right? So it was around that time that I was like, you know what? I think I should reduce that. And my wife at one point said to me, Alex, I find this kind of funny because like I don't consider you to have a drinking problem, but yet you're wanting to be conscientious about cutting back. And and usually the experience for people with drinking problems is that when family members or friends come to them with it, they're very resistant to identifying that problem. So for me, like on that, I had to kind of like unwind some of the habits that I built up, right? And that might have been like, at the end of a work day, a couple of days a week, having a drink. I think that's a very easy unwinding process to go through, right, for a lot of people. But like I had also gotten into, following different blogs and following YouTube channels and joining on Facebook groups and stuff like that. And, in sort of like, bourbon type culture, there's, like hard to find bottles that people will always kind of, be looking around for, right? So there's sort of part of like a scarcity aspect to it there that, makes it, more attractive for people to find. And so I just like completely disengaged from all of those groups. So then like I didn't have that cue of, putting the thought of, alcohol in my mind any longer. Basically.
And so when you made that decision to cut back, sounds like primarily for health prevention. Were there actual like goals? Like was it X amount of drinks a week, or how did you define that?
Yeah, so I wanted to really fall back into within what would be sort of like a safe drinking level, right? And also being Canadian, you may have heard about 2 years ago, Canada's health organization came out and said, well, there actually is no safe drinking level, right?
Yes, I remember that.
Yep. The lowest level of risk is not drinking. And then, every step you take up from there increases your risk, and it kind of actually goes up exponentially beyond sort of like 7 drinks a week and so forth. So for me, yeah, I wanted to cut it back down to, less than 7 drinks a week, which I'm happy I've been able to achieve. Still trying to take that down lower. I've learnt that the presence of even a small amount of alcohol in your system can end up affecting your quality of sleep, because as you go through different sleep cycles, from what I understand, the presence of alcohol actually reduces the depth of the sleep cycles, and it's really the depth of the cycle that really helps determine the quality of the sleep that you're having. Going through periods of like say not having a drink for a week or whatever, like I have really found actually like the quality of my sleep has improved. And I've also actually found that even though I might have less sleep than I might have had traditionally, like before I made any change, I actually feel like I have more energy. You mentioned earlier the social aspect of alcohol and having drinks with other people and so forth. And I think people who, want to cut back sometimes feel nervous or some level of like, or dis-ease about how are they going to navigate social interactions around that. You know, Not that I've given up drinking completely or anything like that, but there also have been times that I've decided like not to drink in a social circumstance. And honestly, I don't think people really care. I think now it's becoming, more and more common for people to either drink, non-alcoholic beers. Unfortunately, I actually don't enjoy them. So I'll just kind of more stick to like, a seltzer or a soda water or something like that instead. I think now, fortunately, most people just don't necessarily even ask about it, right? I think it would be terrible to be in a situation whereby like, heavy drinking is sort of part of the culture. I actually remember when I first came to Canada as an exchange student, I had taken a train from Kingston, Ontario out to Moncton in New Brunswick. And on that train, I was talking to a lady. She was a little bit older than myself, but she was like a First Nations Canadian. And she was telling me that in her community, the expectation is that you're going to show up at a party with a 2-4 of beer. And like, if you don't, people ask like, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you getting smashed? Right? If you're finding it hard in certain social circles, to just change that social circle as well as best you can.
You mentioned screen time before bed. Just to get into the specifics there, does that mean you switch your phone off like a couple hours before bed?
Well, I just won't use it. Like I won't, watch, TV, or I won't use the computer because of the blue light. Likewise from the phone, I won't, do stuff on the phone. So actually, I do keep my phone on because I use it as like my alarm.
You said when we spoke last time that TV is just doesn't provide you any value in your life. It's just, you don't watch it. I would say that that's one area that I'm focused on right now, is just cutting back on TV. I feel like I watch too much TV. It doesn't provide me value. And I feel guilty after, like, could have done something more meaningful with that time last night. But then that night when I tell myself I won't, I'm like exhausted. I'm like, oh, I just want to watch something brainless for an hour before I go to bed. Was that easy to give up TV?
I think one thing that makes TV attractive is you end up getting sucked into stories, right? For me, I just wasn't finding TV shows that interesting, so it's just kind of like where I didn't put in my time, right? But then one TV show that I really enjoyed for a couple of years was the History Channel's Vikings. So what I would do is I'd watch it on my iPad on my exercise bike. Right. So then you can just, combine the two. I find, exercising on a stationary thing, like it'd be a bike or a treadmill, the time passes a lot better if you're entertained. A lot of people like to unwind in front of the TV. There's no problem in that. But, just personally, I would kind of prefer to, I don't know, read a book or go for a walk, do something like that.
When I was kind of in party mode, you come home, even if it's not that late, but you've had a couple drinks, I wasn't able to read a book. And so when I started to make that transition and to rediscover my love of books, I was like, I missed it. And so to me, that's like a big motivator. Now, here's the challenge. And I've noticed in this conversation, you bring up books and you're able to remember and recall like the key things that stood out to you. And it sounds like you're able to still put them to use, even though you may have read that book some time ago. Now maybe for this conversation, you refreshed yourself, but that's one thing that I struggle with. I read this book, I'm like, this is great. I rabbit ear some pages. I may even highlight a thing or two, but like it doesn't, the information dissipates over time and not that much time. How do you keep that information fresh?
I remember I learned from a consultant a long time ago that like, your idea and your proposal or your pitch or whatever is only worth as much as the paper it's written on if it isn't implemented, right? So to me, like trying to take things away from books and incorporating them into my life is an important thing. Otherwise, like what's the point in reading it, right? But so what I do when I read a book is I typically like annotate on the side. Like I might put a little star next to like an important sentence or kind of flag a paragraph. And then after I've read the book, I actually have another notebook that I'll end up sort of just jotting down what were kind of sort of the key takeaways for me from that book, right? And every now and then, it might be in response to just sort of thinking about a challenge, or maybe I'll realize I haven't referred to that other notebook in a while. I'll take a bit of a flip through it and be like, oh yeah, the key ideas from that book were those things, or the key ideas from that other book were these other things. And so then that kind of sort of helps me refresh it as well. Another thing I did about a year ago was actually start a book club with a couple of other dads in my neighborhood here. And so that's been quite helpful. We typically unanimously select the book that we're going to read, right? And then, we give ourselves up to 3 months to be able to get through it. There's a lot of, we're all busy and stuff. But then I find sort of like in preparation for the conversation around the book, you end up thinking more about it. And then obviously if you end up, discussing a book for an hour or two, it kind of sort of really helps reinforce those ideas as well. And often I've found, say, a couple of meetings later, when we're talking, we might refer to back, oh yeah, well that's kind of like, so-and-so's concept of whatever. So it just kind of keeps it fresh from that perspective.
I love that, by the way, the book club. That's not something I've ever been a part of.
Neither had I.
I can see how, but you started it, right?
Yeah. So I'm a pretty extroverted guy, and so I know a lot of the dads and guys from around the neighborhood here, and so I kind of thought about, okay, so who are the other guys in the neighborhood that would likely be interested in sort of personal development type of books, and approached some of them. We started that back in January of this year. But what we actually also do is we, although we might only talk about a book every 3 months, we'll still get together on the other months in between, just for like a social catch up and just talk about what's going on for each of us.
In terms of physical, is there anything that you feel listeners might appreciate from your gym routine, or are you working with a one-on-one trainer? Is there a particular app that you really love?
I think an important thing around the physical aspect is just to pick something that you enjoy, right? Like it doesn't matter if you're playing basketball or squash or running or rowing, just pick something that you like, right? And then there's like a natural pull to it rather than you feel like you're pushing yourself to go and do it. I think it's also good to mix things up from time to time, right? Because if you're always doing the same routine or running the same course or whatever, it's naturally going to get boring. It's like anything else. Like the level of enjoyment that you get from something diminishes the more you've had it. So you sort of keep.
Do you do any team sports, or is it all solo? Are you a pickleballer?
I'm not a pickleballer. My wife and son, and actually my mother-in-law, they all love pickleball, but it's not something that I've gotten into.
Hearing about it, I need to try it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. On the mental health side, we talked about the life coach, but I also wanted to talk about your mindfulness practice. I know you mentioned meditation earlier. Can you tell us about that?
For sure. So I try to meditate 3 times a day. I usually meditate in the morning, and that might be, around the breakfast time before I work out. If it's not then, it typically tends more to be like after my daughter has left for school. Right, then the house is just quiet again before I really get into my work day. And then I just find the other times during the day that work well for me is after lunch. Right? Then I'll just take 10 minutes to go and meditate at that time. And I also find in the evening that winding down phase before going to sleep, I'll meditate again during that period. And I just try to take an approach of just try to be blank in my mind or focusing on my breath, trying to relax. And for me, that's what I've found has worked really well. From the mental health perspective as well, we've talked about reading quite a bit, and I think just learning new ideas and trying to apply them to myself, I found that really helpful. The past couple of months, I have started journaling each day. It's something I'd heard about the past couple of years, and it's sort of been sporadic but it never really built a good habit around it. And I learned about the idea of growth journaling. I sort of looked at different blogs, and sort of like what I found works well for me is, as I start my work day, I'll jot down, okay, so like of my key personal goals that I have that might be either relating to my own fitness or building the business or from a household or family perspective. What are the key things I want to do towards achieving those goals today? And I'll typically try to limit it to two or three for each of those categories. And then that kind of helps provide me with a focus for the day. But the other thing I do from the journaling perspective is I'll also jot down a couple of thoughts I have about how I'm feeling from a mindset perspective. So it's just kind of checking in with myself. Am I feeling in a positive mindset, or am I anxious about something? Is something really bothering me? And then the third thing that I'll do in that morning journaling is writing down a couple of things that I'm grateful for. Right. So I think that helps one really see what are the good things in your life or circumstance. And I think one's performance and enjoyment of life is just so much better when you have a more positive outlook or lens that you're seeing the world through. And then at the end of the day, I'll jot down all my key wins or growth from today. And the reason why I do that is because then it sort of, even though I might not have thought the day went particularly well, it allows me the opportunity to be able to identify, hey, there were actually a couple of things that went well from today, right? Whether it be tasks getting off the list, or also looking at what was a new experience for me, what was the growth that came from that day. And although there might not necessarily be big growth every day, but they're typically smaller growth things. But over time, those compound, right? So then you can kind of look back at, in the future, whether it be month over month or year over year, you can be like, oh yeah, I've made some really good progress there over the past year. But I also try to consider what went well today and what I could do in other, why that went well. So then I can sort of think about how can I replicate that good thing in the future, right? And the contrary point to that is what didn't go well, right? And maybe why something didn't go well, and what I could do in the future to either reduce the likelihood of that thing happening again or the negative impact that thing would have.
Oh, I like the structured approach where what you're going to be writing every morning and then every evening, because it removes the kind of the fear of the blank page that I can relate to, because I have my journal, it's right next to me, and I have another book on top, so I could tell I haven't opened it in a while, and it's a goal of mine to write more, but then it's daunting. And also when I do find myself opening my journal with a goal to write about something, I tend to write about something else. I lose focus. Also, while I'm writing, I have this overwhelming feeling that I can't wait to be done writing. So it's I'm writing very quickly, and and so if I knew, okay, I'm going to open the journal and I'm going to bullet down 3 things I'm grateful for, the way you walked us through it, I think that would make me more effective at doing it and more consistent.
My experience prior to that approach that I just described was exactly the same as yours, right? I kind of had this intention. I'd done it sporadically. I did find it helpful when I did it, but it was always what am I really going to write about, And I just found making it easy by having that framework or sort of set of questions or topics for me to consider really helped me just jot down the points around it and get the benefit from the process.
So what I'd like to do is link to that format in the episode notes. And you mentioned a blog. Did you pluck from different areas?
I did. Yeah, I kind of looked over maybe half a dozen blogs and kind of drew what I thought would work for me or what was interest for me from the different components. So I'm sorry to say there isn't necessarily a link, but I'd be happy to provide you with a brief description of it that you could put in the show notes.
Okay, great. Let's do that. I do want to switch gears to work-life balance and talk about the major career switch that you made, kind of what brought that journey.
Yeah, for sure. My career after the pandemic was really focused around IT and IT consulting, and that's what I was really focused on. And during all of my professional career, I'd always wanted to advance within the company, right, or whatever company I was in. I always wanted to take on more responsibility. My goal was to be a senior executive or leading an organization myself. But during the stay-at-home period of the pandemic, I found I was really enjoying the time that I was having with my family. And my boss at the time, who I did really like, had shared with me that she was going to be retiring. And I found in myself that I actually didn't have any interest in applying for her role, because I thought, you know what, it's going to be a bunch more stress. It's going to be less time with family, like, more time pressure and so forth. But my wife and I had, made a decision to live well within our means, and we were saving a lot of money. And so I thought, you know what, the extra money that would come with the promotion would probably just end up in the bank account. And that number in itself isn't going to make me any happier. So I decided not to apply for that role. And then that kind of sort of like inadvertently set in motion a series of thoughts in my own mind, which was like, well, like, what am I really doing? I've got about another, say, 25, 30 years of working life left. There's not other roles in this organization that I'm interested in, but I don't want to be doing the same job for the next 25, 30 years. I think when one's looking to advance in a company, you're able to put up with the frustrating aspects of your job, because you kind of tell yourself, hey, if I do a good job overall, I'll get to move up, and then I get to hand that problem off to somebody else. This isn't going to be my problem forever. But when I lost that ambition for advancement myself, those frustrating aspects of the company's approach started to really get at me more. And then separate from it, my mum had come from Australia in the summer of 2022 to visit us just as like a tourist for like 2 months. We actually had a trip as a family planned to Europe. And 2 weeks into her trip here to Boston, she started having a lot of pain and ended up needing to be hospitalized. And it was at that time that we found out that she had a stage 4 colon cancer. And so that was definitely a huge shock for us. And initially we thought she had, 2, 3, maybe 5 years left with us. So I was planning on taking leave from work, traveling with her back to Australia, helping set her up with, chemotherapy and that kind of course of action there. But unfortunately, the cancer was so advanced, and she just deteriorated so quickly that she ended up being hospitalized another 2 times, so 3 times in total in a space of about 4 or 5 weeks. She transitioned into a hospice here and it actually ended up passing away within 2 months of receiving the diagnosis. All right.
I'm really sorry to hear all that, Alex.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. It was definitely very challenging and a tough time, but it gave me the perspective that the timeline of someone's passing. There's kind of 2 extremes of it. There's the very instantaneous, like say, car accident or heart attack type of approach. And then there's the other extreme, which is like the multi-year chronic illness type of problem. And I think there's like real problem with like both of those extremes. In my mother's case, 2 months is actually a relatively short period of time to be ill, right? At like end of life, right? But it's also enough time that allows you to make any changes to your affairs that you might want to get put in place. It's enough time to be able to reach out to friends and family and other loved ones. So fortunately gave her the opportunity to be able to do that. And actually, since I'd moved away from Australia, a concern that had been in my mind was like, how am I going to be around for and support both of my parents at their end of life, being on the other side of the world myself. And so, I guess a blessing that kind of came from it was that her being in a hospice here was that I was able to spend every day with her, that she was in the hospice and so forth. So we got to spend a lot of time together, which was great. I don't want to minimize the challenge that it was, but in the end, it was actually like a relatively good way for her to go. Right. So then I'd continued my leave from my company because I had to go out to Australia. Obviously, she, to have her funeral, and she wanted to be buried out there, and I had to sort of take care of some things from the estate. And then when I came back to work, I found my heart just wasn't in it anymore. And I was like, really, I still had sort of those like lingering frustrations that I mentioned earlier, but I was also kind of thinking to myself, like, hey, like, what am I really doing here if, my mum obviously just passed away, and completely independently from my mum's passing, my dad needed to transition into a nursing home because he had had a stroke back in 2016. And I just thought, like, I don't want to be living a life that I'm not necessarily happy with and fulfilled by, right? And my wife and I had had an interest in real estate from the perspective of, wanting to build like a real estate portfolio and looking to make money from rehabbing properties and then renting them out. We talked about it quite a bit, and we decided that I would be able to add greater value to our family and have increased flexibility and be healthier and more time with my wife and kids if I stepped away from full-time work and sort of put my focus on doing the real estate investment for ourselves, as well as leading our household and making sure our kids are well supported.
Well, thank you for sharing a lot of that very personal story. And a lot of people feel the way that you described, right? Where they may go into work and think, what am I doing here? My heart's not in this, but they continue the sentence. And in your case, you did something about it, which really isn't easy. And given what you had just been through with your mom and your dad, what pushed you to actually action thoughts that people have every day, all the time?
I think it was just recognizing that I was unhappy in what I had been doing. I think it was, a good job, and I think it's a good company and so forth, right? But I think of this idea of like, say, fit, and it's like a fit between one's interests and their personality and their capabilities and circumstances and the requirements of a job. So at one point in time, there might be a great fit. And for a long time, there was a great fit for me, right? I just eventually realized that, this isn't the right fit for me anymore, right? And I feel very fortunate that my wife was very, supportive of the idea. She's told me since that, she actually greatly prefers me in my new role as opposed to my old role, right? And it's great. I feel very happy in a lot of ways. I'm very fortunate for a lot of things, but it wasn't an easy transition. And in the period between tendering my resignation and my last day, I actually kind of went through the thought process of redefining success for myself, right? Because I think in Western culture, particularly for men, success is defined by career success. And that's like I should just say, we define success for ourselves as like career success, right? And it's all about someone successful if they, make it to VP or whatever it is, right? But it's all around career. So I kind of like looked at redefining success for myself around, I'll call it 4 pillars, right? One being, the strength of my family relationships, like particularly like, with my wife and kids. The second was taking care of myself, making sure my own physical and mental health is healthy. Because this wasn't that long after I'd gone through sleep problems and anxiety issues during the 2020 odd period of pandemic. The third pillar I see is like, having strong friendships and connectedness to the community that you're in. And then finally, my fourth, measure around it was like, am I adding financial value to our household? And from my perspective, that last one's really the bonus. And I think about them in that order because, if your family relationships are suffering, the rest of those other things that I just mentioned are going to suffer as well. You're not going to have the energy or the bandwidth from your partner necessarily to go out and keep fit. You're going to be having a lot of mental angst. You're probably going to be consumed with family problems and not seeing friends so much. And you're probably not going to be as effective in your work, right? Because you're going to be weighed down by other problems, or you might just be physically tired from it.
How did you conceptualize those 4 pillars?
I remember I was still sitting at my desk in the office, and I was kind of thinking, like, sort of, I was falling into that trap of like, oh man, I'm defining my own success and worth by around career success, right? And I've got to think more broadly than that. And so it's kind of like, sort of drew a lot on books that I'd read or conversations that I'd had. It just kind of like considered like what's important to me, right? If I can broaden out my personal definition of success here, then I can reduce that as a source of anxiety, right? Because I think, not living up to one's own definition of success is a very natural cause of anxiety.
In order to make the decisions that you made, like you needed a safe space, like you needed safety to really process and and make those big changes. And it sounds like you have that in your life,
Yeah.
but not everyone does. For example, if family is running on one income, or it could also be emotionally if they're having to support their family members or dealing with trauma or whatever.
And I totally agree with and recognize the concerns that people might have around like what you just mentioned. But I also think we all put what I call like self-limiting beliefs on ourselves, right? Like I couldn't leave my job because of X, or I couldn't work out because of Y or whatever, right? Something I found really helpful is like really look out for those limiting beliefs. And whenever I find myself saying I can't or no, I'll ask myself, well, how could I? Like, what would it take to make this work? Right. So then you can shift into a bit of a solutioning thing, or like, and it's something you can use when negotiating with your kids or other people. It's not just necessarily within yourself. Back when I was still working as an IT consultant, a more senior person in the company came along to me and said, Alex, I need this specialized resource that's on your team for this other client project. And I was like, okay. In that case, it was like very much a zero-sum game, right? And so I sat down with that guy to understand his perspective and then say, well, okay, like, what would it take to make it work with somebody different? And we identified what were the aspects of the role and what other options were. And then he kind of ended up coming to the agreement with me like, oh yeah, I guess I don't actually need your guy, right? So that was kind of healthy. Whenever you're running into this, oh, I can't do so-and-so, just you really try to ask yourself like, well, like what would it take to make it work? And all of the answers might not necessarily be feasible, but it will give you food for thought on how you could start to make some of those changes that you want to make.
Thoughts you were hoping to get out that we didn't get the chance to cover?
If people are interested in adopting new habits, I really want to recommend a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's a very well written book. It's very approachable. Lots of practical tips in it. I found that a really helpful book from just thinking about, what are the habits that I want to adopt? What are the habits that I want to break? Right. And there's small things in there such as identifying, what is the identity that you want to have. And then you can, as you're going through your day, you can ask yourself, hey, is that action consistent with the identity that I want or not? And so it helps maintain that, but it also provides a good framework for removing cues that may tempt you towards a behavior that you want to break, or putting cues in place to adopt other ones, or trying to make it easy to do something. And we talked about journaling earlier, right? So I found it helpful to do that by having that framework, right? That made it easier for me to be able to sit down and write. And he has he talks about the idea of intention planning. So you can say like if you can plan more clearly what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and where you're going to do it, you're more likely to follow through with it. Right? So I thought he had a lot of great ideas in his book if people are interested in adopting habits.
So we'll link down to the books that you've mentioned throughout this conversation. One question, why bother? Why make the effort? Sometimes it's self-evident to people who already make the effort, but there are a lot of people who aren't making the effort, right? It's like, why would I change anything? I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
So I think one of the nice benefits that can come from personal growth is that you can enjoy your life more. So I think part of it is recognizing what aspects of your life you might not necessarily get full enjoyment from, or might actually be like negative aspects, and it helps you remove those from your life. Likewise, it can also help you identify things that are going to actively improve your life. And so if it gives you like a better life experience, to me, I don't know why you wouldn't necessarily want to pursue those things, right? We're all only alive for a certain period of time, right? We've got this gift of, roughly 80 years on Earth. And I think trying to make the most of that time is important, and another really influential book for me was 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. And in that, he has this paragraph which talks about the sum of your life experience is essentially, or your life experience is essentially the sum of your moment-to-moment experiences, right? So if you can take greater pleasure from the day-to-day experiences, then you're going to have a happier, healthier life.
You said to enjoy life and to improve life. I think improve 100%. Enjoy life. I would add a caveat, which is it's not always enjoyable in the short term. In fact, it could be quite hard, painful. It could actually increase suffering in the short term. But if you're thinking about it in the long term, which I think is the right way to think about it, then I think it does make life more enjoyable.
So I agree in the moment that the action you might be taking might not necessarily feel enjoyable. Like every day, I might necessarily feel like, highly motivated to get out for a run if like, my legs are hurting or whatever. But I try to tell myself, hey, at least this is a winning action, right? At least I'm taking a step towards winning. I'm taking a step towards the goals that I have and the life that I want to be having. And then I actually find it sort of gets me out of that. I might not be enjoying it right now to then being more positive about it and getting enjoyment from that time.
One thing I'm struck by in this conversation is that we talked a lot about really healthy habits, and you strike me as disciplined in all the things that we've discussed, but at the same time, not rigid. You don't describe them or talk about them in a very rigid way. When I've asked you about alcohol, it's not like you're like, I have like one drink like on Wednesday. And like, it sounds like you allow yourself some space to kind of like flow with life within guardrails and actions and routines that you've implemented that have worked for you. And it sounds like you maintain an open mind to evolve.
Totally agree with a lot of the things that you just mentioned there. And I think, using the term discipline is a very negative thing because you've kind of got this, idea of like some structure being imposed on you or whatever, right? But if you go back to, picking things that you enjoy, right, that just makes it kind of like easy to do, right? Or if you have it being, if it's an activity that's consistent with an identity that you want, then it's just more inherent drive to be able to do it. So it doesn't feel like it needs a lot of like negative connotations around it. Love the term guardrails there. I think it's also important to make sure you have flexibility to also go with the flow of life.
I realized that I meant to start with the question, what does growing up mean? And I never asked you that. Care to respond?
The first thing that came to mind is actually it's around like being willing to adapt your behavior or response to a change in your context, right? Such as a change in one's responsibility or your environment or changing objectives or your body. I think when you recognize, hey, I really should change, growing up is being willing to go ahead and make the change that might initially be uncomfortable or might be different from what you were doing previously, but you're willingly going into that change, right? Another aspect I think is it's also important to part of growing up is taking a bigger picture or a longer term view on things, right? Instead of acting in a very transactional way, recognizing that all relationships are more than just like one-time things. They're longer term things. I also think part of growing up is being big enough to, take responsibility when things might not work out well or as planned, and being willing to recognize your own contribution to the problems, right? Like, I think every party that is around a problem played a role in it. It's not to say that everybody had an equal contribution to it, right? But it's trying to like, move away from the idea of there's one person to blame for a problem, right? There's like, I think everybody to the party contributed to it. They might not have contributed equally, right? But and it's not absolving people of it, but everyone has a role to play. And I think it's also about feeling comfortable to genuinely apologize to the other party that you may have injured through your actions, and being willing to learn from the incident. But I also think another part of maturity or growing up is being able and willing to make yourself vulnerable in important conversations, right? And that can be sharing your own emotions or perspective on a situation or a conversation or a relationship or whatever it is, but being willing to kind of like actually really share like what's actually like on the inside for you, right? Finally, I think growing up is having the maturity to be able to empathize and understand the other person's perspective, right? It's about putting your own view aside for long enough to be able to understand how they might view the world or view a circumstance. You don't have to agree with them, right? But it's being able to like understand how they view something. And I found that has also then helped me come up with, more creative ways in solving a problem, right? And if you can play back to the other person your understanding of, how it is in their own shoes, they're going to be a lot more like, people want to feel heard, right? And so if you can help that other person feel heard and you can put it in your own words, then I think that's an important thing to be able to do.
A lot of great content there in your response. Willingness to change, taking a long-term view on relationships, taking responsibility, taking ownership for your part, being able to ask for forgiveness, learning from your mistakes, being vulnerable, showing empathy, a genuine understanding of what it's like to be in the other person's shoes. Alex, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on. It was really great. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you did as well, and I'm sure our listeners will too.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. I hope it resonated with you. I realize that as we end episode 4, I have yet to have a female guest on the show. But don't worry, that's coming soon. In the meantime, I could use your help. If you know any remarkable women or men with a personal transformation story that would resonate with our listeners, please reach out to me. The encouragement I've received over the past few weeks has been truly touching. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do so is by sharing it with others who might find value in it. Wishing you and your loved ones a warm and happy holiday season filled with love, inspiration, and above all, meaningful moments.